Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating. We're unpacking a master legal dossier from a mock trial, and we're looking at the anatomy of a complete systemic failure. What actually happens when the safety nets that are designed to shield our constitutional rights just completely break down? Today, we're talking all about judicial neglect. Going through these source documents, the whole thing really boils down to one critical question. What happens when the very agencies tasked with protecting us simply refuse to look at the evidence? And to be clear, we're not talking about a failure to find evidence. We're talking about a willful, deliberate refusal to even acknowledge it. When local, state, and federal administrative systems all overlap, how does a massive structural failure like this happen? And honestly, how does it get buried?
So here's our roadmap for this investigation. We'll define judicial neglect, outline the Corey Stickney case, look at the wall of indifference, break down the federal nonfeasance, and finally weigh constitutional rights against lived reality. Let's jump in.
Starting right off with Section 1, defining judicial neglect. $25 million. That's a staggering number, right? Well, that is the liability figure determined in the civil mock adjudication we're studying today. And this was, quote, joint and several liability, which is basically legal speak, meaning all the involved agencies collectively share the hook for the entire amount. Seeing a number that high instantly tells you the massive scale of the systemic breakdowns being alleged here. So what exactly warrants a $25 million liability?
Well, that brings us to the formal definition of judicial neglect. Notice how the legal texts actually ground this concept. We aren't just talking about a simple bureaucratic mistake or, someone being slow with paperwork. We're talking about systemic administrative nonfeasance, which means authorities are actively ignoring their protective duties. It's deliberate indifference under the color of authority. Basically, when officials use their administrative discretion as a shield to just ignore active statutory violations, the end result is a severe constitutional deprivation for the citizens involved.
Moving into our second segment, the Stickney case outlined. To really wrap our heads around judicial neglect, the dossier builds an empirical timeline based on the mock prosecution's arguments. They focus on three foundational pillars of structural violation. First, extrajudicial cross-state child custody interference, which is essentially the unauthorized transport of children across state lines. Second, systemic danger and neglect, where clear physical risks to those kids were completely ignored. And third, continuous unwarranted state surveillance. So let's take a look at the primary evidence for that first pillar. In the initial plea from the plaintiff, Corey Stickney, he reports children being moved across state lines from Kansas to Nebraska without any proper notice or legal authorization. Now, under Kansas Statute 21-5409, aggravated interference with parental custody is a felony-level offense. It's a huge deal. Yet the documentation shows that local police, the sheriff's office, and child services consistently categorize this felony violation as just a, quote, civil matter for family court. They completely ignored the actual criminal text of the law. And that leads us directly into our next section, a wall of indifference.
From there, the documentation shows the danger escalating pretty dramatically. There's a formal complaint sent to the Kansas Attorney General that explicitly details how the mother's partner, who the children were exposed to, was actually charged with multiple felonies. We're talking 3 counts of aggravated child endangerment, 5 counts of criminal holding, and 5 counts of aggravated assault, all involving the minor children. So the authorities were formally alerted, on paper, to some incredibly severe physical dangers. Now, you'd probably expect a pretty swift intervention based on those documents, right? But actually, the response from the Kansas Attorney General's office is wild. They neutrally state that they, quote, cannot serve as your legal counsel or advisor. They effectively dismiss these massive criminal allegations purely administratively. They literally pointed the plaintiff to a toll-free legal aid number instead of initiating an investigation into documented aggravated child endangerment. And when this was escalated up to the federal level, the response was arguably even colder. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division just sent back a template rejection email. Fun fact, to put this in perspective, the DOJ gets over 100,000 civil rights complaints every single year, meaning the vast majority just hit a bureaucratic wall exactly like this one. The email literally says, after careful review, we have decided not to take any further action on your complaint. They just close the door without an investigation, completely ignoring the paper trail of felony allegations. Which brings us to our fourth segment, the federal nonfeasance.
The mock court files here set up a clash between two massive legal concepts.
On one side, you've got Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 242. This is the federal statute specifically designed to criminalize the deprivation of rights under the color of law. On the other side, you have administrative discretion, which is basically the bureaucratic loophole used to willfully ignore statutory violations. The fascinating legal argument here is that when agencies consistently use administrative omission as their standard practice, it actually proves, quote, specific intent, meaning they knew exactly what they were doing when they violated those civil rights.
Corey Stickney actually recognized this exact legal contradiction. In his documented challenge back to the DOJ, he makes the argument that when law enforcement flat out refuses to investigate alleged felonies and instead just tells victims to go hire a private attorney, the justice system is effectively denying citizens equal protection under the 14th Amendment. Because criminal violations can't just be brushed off or mischaracterized simply because they happen to occur adjacent to family court proceedings.
This leads us right to our final section, constitutional rights versus reality.
As we peel back the final layers of this dossier, we find some subtle but absolutely crucial subplots that compound this whole systemic failure. For instance, the mock trial files included evidence of a financial transaction placed in review via Cash App. The prosecution introduced technical logs that point to an alleged, ongoing pattern of state financial targeting and continuous digital surveillance.
But the really crucial point here is why this surveillance was allegedly happening. The mock trial court examined claims that this unwarranted state surveillance wasn't just, a simple invasion of privacy. It was actually identified as a systemic tactic designed specifically to destabilize the plaintiff, financially and digitally, basically destroying his ability to effectively fight back and secure his legal rights.
Ultimately, the dossier brings all of this back to the 14th Amendment, highlighting two profound deprivations. First, substantive due process. That's essentially the fundamental inherent right of a parent to care for their biological children, which was completely shattered here by the lack of protection orders. Second, the Equal Protection Clause. The argument is that the state engaged in selective non-enforcement by denying Corey Stickney the standard criminal custody protections that are routinely provided to other citizens. I want to highlight this one summary quote directly from the case files because it really hits the nail on the head. The law on paper is clear. What remains is enforcement. For Corey Stickney and his children, justice delayed has already been justice denied for far too long. I mean, it perfectly points out that tragic gap between theoretical statutes sitting in some law book and the lived reality of everyday citizens navigating these broken systems. Which brings us to the ultimate, lingering question of this entire explainer. If the guardians of the law choose administrative discretion over their actual statutory duty, who is left to enforce the Constitution? When the very system designed to protect you is the exact same system ignoring the evidence, where do you turn? It's a really complex, deeply concerning reality of judicial neglect that demands our attention, and it definitely sparks a desperate need for structural legal reform. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the systems around you.